As COVID first emerged in Wuhan, of course everybody was looking at it in the newspaper and wondering if this disease was going to be important worldwide. The chief science advisors internationally very quickly connected with one another so we could swap notes. So I think my first email that mentioned the disease that became known as COVID-19 was on January the 4th, so right at the very beginning. And that was from the UK Chief Science Advisor, Sir Patrick Vallance, who wanted to check in with his counterparts worldwide and really make sure that we were on the ball monitoring this disease and working out when we would get alarmed.
COVID-19, again, we're seeing that science has a key role to play. The ability to use a combination of science and researchers, both domestically and internationally, to inform modelling, to understand the epidemiology, to look at surveillance, to understand the testing regimes that are being undertaken and look at what's happening in New Zealand compared to other countries. All of these different elements where research touches on the response effort to make sure that we're doing our very best for New Zealand.
We were watching an pandemic, as it later became known, play out in real time. And so the level of information available was quite low initially, but then every day, in fact every hour, as the pandemic continued, we were able to get information from our colleagues overseas.
It was a particular challenge because the science was changing as we were communicating it. And so sometimes you would advise something on Tuesday and it would be wrong by Friday. And so communicating the uncertainty around the science was absolutely critical. So what we did know, what we probably knew, and what was quite speculative. So triaging that knowledge as it came in. And I think it was really when Italy took off that we began to see in New Zealand that we had a real problem.
There was a network of chief science advisors, obviously, which my chief science advisor was a part of, but between Australia and New Zealand there was a very close connection. They fed the same information through to us, which then triggered a range of decisions being made very quickly here too.
There are 14 new cases of COVID-19 confirmed in the past 24 hours in New Zealand. The locations of these new cases are 4 in Wellington, 1 in Taranaki, 3 in Auckland, 1 in Waikato, 1 in Taupo, 1 in Manawatu, and 2 in Nelson. This brings the total number of COVID-19 cases in New Zealand to 53 confirmed, and we have 4 probable cases.
It's a one in a century event. No one alive today really has experience of dealing with a pandemic like this. Events that are really beyond people's experience and particularly beyond politicians and the general public's experience. Then using evidence and using models, is absolutely crucial in getting those decisions right. You can't go with your gut feeling about how you think the world's going to go. You can't necessarily go with democratic choices, although ultimately, politicians have to be supported by the public in order to make these things work. But evidence really, comes into its own because you've got so little to go on and it's so removed from our everyday experience that it becomes absolutely crucial to making the right decisions.
We made use of 2 groups who helped us significantly with modelling. One was Professor Nick Wilson and his colleague Michael Baker at the University of Otago here in Wellington, and the others was Sean Hendy, who leads a group, multidisciplinary group from the University of Auckland. And in both cases they developed those early predictive models which were widely discussed, and in fact the Prime Minister used a couple of the graphs in her briefings. And what I think the most useful thing about the early modelling was the way in which it galvanised decision making, a sense of urgency. The fact that the number of cases were doubling every day was a very powerful galvanising element, because of course the exponential nature of the epidemic became very apparent in those last few days as decisions had to be made about the border and alert levels. It was really the concern about the risk of increasing deaths in New Zealand that led to those decisions being easier to make, I think.
New Zealanders would have seen often we were holding up the curves. Everyone was in the space of flattening the curve. And I was showing some modelling that had been done around what a flattened curve would look like in New Zealand. If that is what we have to do, we have to create a mechanism so New Zealanders know when things have escalated and we have to pull it back. And that was the origin of the alert level system. On that Saturday, in the back of my mind was, yes, that I was going to have to take New Zealanders up that scale pretty quickly.
A model is a way of representing the way we think about the world. And often we do it mathematically. We can write down an equation that we think describes the world, and we then take that and compare that to experiment and experimental data. So one thing you could do, for example, is look at the worst case scenario. Now that is probably something that's never going to happen, because of course you know that once the disease is here, people's behaviour is going to change in many different ways in which that might be quite difficult to model, especially since they depend on how the disease spreads. So the worst case scenario is almost something that will never happen, and you kind of know it will never happen, but it's still an important thing to model and to give people a sense of what is it that we're making decisions relative to.
We were really lucky in New Zealand in that the government wanted to see the evidence, wanted to make sure that the policy action that we took, sometimes urgently, was based on the best possible evidence. And we were also really lucky in that we had time. So all around the world, different scenarios were playing out. Those sorts of scenarios were appearing in the models that the Otago group were doing and that Sean Hendy was doing. And there's nothing like a country actually experiencing the scenario that you've just modelled to lend confidence to the fact that it is quite likely in New Zealand.
A state of national emergency has been declared today due to COVID-19 at 12:21 by the Minister of Civil Defence, the Honourable Pene Henare, under the Civil Defence Emergency Management Act 2002. The state of national emergency has been declared because of the unprecedented nature of this global pandemic and to ensure the government has all the powers it needs to slow the spread of COVID-19 and reduce its impact.
Good afternoon, everyone. We are now a matter of hours away from an unprecedented lockdown of our country in order to combat an unprecedented virus that, left unchecked, would have an unacceptable toll on New Zealanders. I have one simple message for New Zealanders today as we head into the next 4 weeks. Stay at home. It will break the chain of transmission and it will save lives.
Other countries have really struggled. I mean, the United Kingdom, for example, the United States, both countries that probably could have mounted much better responses. I mean, I think the United Kingdom, it certainly was late in acting relative to other countries in Europe. If you look at a country like Germany, it acted much quicker, despite being having infections slightly earlier than the UK. The UK reacted quite slowly. I think one of the reasons that happened is because of the type of politics that's been happening in these countries. You know, you've got populist governments, both in the United Kingdom and the US, and populist governments, you know, they don't use evidence well. They tend to position themselves against the experts.
One of the critical roles that the science community played in New Zealand was to really communicate clearly the science as it evolved and as it changed. So there were key individuals that became household names: Michael Baker, Susie Wiles, Sean Hendy, Aisha Verrill, Michelle Dickinson, and I think that New Zealand owes them a beer because they were really tireless in communicating again and again what we were doing, why we were doing it, and how it was grounded in evidence. So I think that part of the scientist role was absolutely vital.
I'm immensely grateful for how Juliet approached the pandemic. So really early on, she brought together a whole group of scientists, communicators, people with different areas of expertise who could look at the literature as it was coming out, so all the studies that were coming out, and very quickly in their area of expertise be able to say, you know, this is what it meant for New Zealand, that kind of thing. And so I was one of those people who was brought in just to say, you know, and she would send me messages, have you seen this study? Have you seen that study? And then, you know, my job was to read it and to go, okay, what does this mean for us? What do we understand about how things are changing, about our knowledge of the virus? How should we be behaving?
And we had to get the country to do something completely unprecedented. You know, we had to lock down for over a month, and you know, in a democracy like New Zealand, you can't do that without consent. You know, if people hadn't wanted to be locked down, and there's no way the government could have really enforced that. So people had to understand why they were doing it, right, and why it was important for the country to do that. So communicating the science behind why we were locking down was really important.
My role in New Zealand has been to communicate to the general public, you know, what's going on, how that knowledge about the virus is changing, and I guess what would be expected of us, how we needed to behave in order to stay safe. And that's obviously changed throughout time. So when the government announced their alert levels, it was then to explain to the public what those alert levels meant and why we needed to do them. Part of it was sort of about being cautious, so explaining why we were going to be coming out of the alert levels slowly.
There were some really important numbers that were floating around. The effective reproduction number, you know, R0, you know, how many people was each infected person going on to infect? That was critical. Just, you know, when the numbers were rising, telling people not to be alarmed, that they were going to come down, and when they were coming down, telling people how long it might be that we have to stay in lockdown to keep those numbers going down to zero. Those were quite important things. There was the other aspects of the science communication as well, which is talking more generally about the disease, talking about hygiene measures and how important those were, and explaining to people what was going on overseas as well. You know, we've had a very different experience in New Zealand, and a big part of that has been because we were able to watch what was happening in other countries that weren't making the same type of decisions we were making.
I saw this graphic going around about this concept called flattening the curve. And so I wanted to write about this concept. But what really struck me about the graphic that was sort of going around social media is that it didn't really fully explain the concept well enough, I felt. Toby Morris is a cartoonist with The Spin-Off. I've admired his work for a long time. He said he would be interested. We had a quick phone chat and I sent him all the graphics that I'd seen already and explained what it was that I thought was missing. And then that was sort of the start of this amazing relationship. He's brought everything that I knew that he would to the graphics that we've done. You know, he brings his values, he humanizes everything to such a beautiful degree. And then I bring the science. This is the message that we're trying to convey. And it has ended up being the collaboration that has had the most impact throughout my entire career. Because, you know, what we've created has ended up being seen by millions of people. And we get messages all the time by people saying how much it's helped them understand something, how much it's changed their behaviour.
We had a lot of commentary from other people in the media, of course, offering their view of the right way to do things. But in the end, I think we were able to see our way through in an organised, planned way, at pace, but I think with good results.
For every decision that was being made, there were people who were mobilising it and making it happen. My chief science advisor played a bigger role than anyone will ever know. We knew the cycle we expected, and seeing it absolutely follow what we believed would happen and then start to come down, you know, it just was that extra assurance that actually what we did was the right thing to do, and the outcome was what we expected it would be.
Science played an enormous role in the global response. I don't think there's ever been a time where the scientific community all around the world came together, shared information. So within weeks of identifying the new virus, it had been sequenced multiple times. Servers were being used in ways that they've never been used before to share data before it was published. And we really very rapidly came to understand everything we could about the virus. And of course the chief science advisors were then in a position to feed that information into government responses.